Daniella Ben-Arie is an independent scholar, writer, and researcher whose work focuses on London as the center of private patronage and collecting. She was co-curator of the exhibition Thomas Hope, Regency Designer, at the V&A in London, and many of you probably saw it at the Bard Graduate Center in New York. In addition, she wrote a chapter on the collecting activities of the Center of the Extended Hope family for the exhibition catalog that was published by Yale University Press, as well as contributing catalog entries to recent work on Boodles celebrating 250 years, 1762 to 2012. Daniella is currently working on a book along with Elizabeth Angelikousis and Ian Jenkins that will reconstruct the private collection of classical sculpture that was formed by William Petty, the first Marquess of Lansdowne, for his home in Berkeley Square in London, as well as its subsequent dispersal. Daniella has also written and researched for television. This morning, she and our next speaker, Jeannie Chappell, are going to do a tag team presentation. We're beginning with the Hope team, or as Jeannie said, the team of Hope, who were cousins and art collectors. And we'll begin with Daniella's presentation on Henry Hope, patron and collector. Please welcome Daniella Ben-Arie.
In October 1794, two ships, the Unity and Hope, set sail from Amsterdam bound for London. The ships had been carefully packed with cases, trunks, and chests. The Unity alone carried 199, containing the most extensive and exquisite collection of paintings, furniture, sculptures in marble and ivory, small bronzes, family silver, porcelain, as well as a large library of books, drawings, and prints. These were the entire transportable possessions belonging to the Hope family of Amsterdam. Thank you. In the art world, the name Hope is most often associated with the Dutch-born but English-based designer and patron Thomas Hope. In 2008, Jeannie Chappell and I worked together on the exhibition Thomas Hope Regency Designer at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Bard Graduate Center in New York, and Jeannie shall be presenting the talk after mine. The exhibition focused on the activities of Thomas Hope, author of Household Furniture and Interior Decoration, which was published by him in 1807. Taking as a starting point his book Household Furniture, which laid out Thomas's principles of interior design, display, and manufacture, the exhibition went on to examine Thomas as a designer, patron, artist, collector, author, and traveler. Household Furniture contained 60 plates of outline engravings showing partial views of the rooms of his house in Duchess Street in London, as well as plates illustrating individual objects. But Thomas was not the first collector of note in his family, and it is not with him that the story of the Hopes as patrons and collectors of art begins. Further to this, without the fortunes made by his family, he would never have had the means to pursue all these activities. For that, we must go back to Amsterdam via Boston, where Thomas Hope's much older second cousin, Henry Hope, was born in around 1735. Little is known of Henry's early life, but he eventually left America and made his way to England, where from 1754 he worked for Gurnell, Hoare and Company in London. In 1762, Henry was invited to live in Amsterdam and to join his uncles Thomas and Adrian Hope as a partner in the family bank. The business had been founded ostensibly by the brothers Thomas and Adrian, who lived in some style, along with Thomas's wife Margaretha Marcellus, first on the Herengracht and later on the Keizersgracht in Amsterdam. A fourth partner, the son of Thomas and Margaretha, was also brought on board. This was John Hope, Henry's first cousin and father of the subject of our 2008 exhibition. In 1762, the bank was renamed Hope and Company. The Hopes may have descended from the Scottish branch of the family, but they were resolutely Dutch, and the name was actually pronounced Hope, not Hope. Hope and Company were Europe's leading merchant bank. Philip Ziegler, in his book on the history of Barings, described them as, at the time, the richest and most powerful merchant bank in Europe, and therefore in the world. William Franklin, while visiting Holland with his father Benjamin Franklin in 1761, wrote a letter to his sister Sarah, who was then living in Philadelphia, in which he mentions, "At Amsterdam, we were recommended to the Hopes, who are ranked amongst the greatest merchants in Europe. One of them sent us his coach to carry us to see everything curious in the city." And Martin Buist, in his History of the Hope Company, writes that while contemporary outsiders refer to them as bankers, the Hopes rarely did so of themselves. In fact, Henry Hope called himself a merchant. Hope and Company raised loans for foreign governments to great success and invested in a variety of things, for example, cochineal, with some losses. And before I change slides, I would just briefly like to address the confusion generated by the Hope family's tendency to repeat names. And as you can see here, there's an uncle Thomas Hope, had a son called John, who had a son called Thomas, who had a cousin called Henry, who had a nephew called Henry Philip, and on it goes. But I trust that it will be clear during the course of my talk to whom I am referring. The wars of Catherine II of Russia were partly funded by Hope and Company, and from 1788, she was given the first of 18 loans to fight the Ottoman Empire. The company saw the Empress as a worthy debtor who could pay them a commission of 6.5% on the loan. In return, Catherine presented, as a personal gift to Henry, a portrait of herself painted by Dmitry Levitsky. The act was described by Henry as a striking example of her magnanimity and a magnificence of the exalted personage. And Henry felt it appropriate to send the artist 100 guineas as thanks. The relationship between the Hope Bank and the Russian Empress was deep, and as thanks she offered him a title, which he declined. Henry lived in a smart house on the Keizersgracht in Amsterdam, and between 1785 and 1788 completed at vast expense the construction of his house, Pavilion Welgelegen, which lay on the outskirts of Haarlem. The interior was more like a palace than the seat of a private gentleman. Henry was one of the very rare exception of being spoken well of by everybody and deserving it. He was most amiable and fully engaged in Welgelegen's design and commission. He worked alongside Michel, Baron de Trinquetti, who, in addition to being an amateur architect, was with the Sardinian consul at The Hague. The executant architect was a Fleming, Jean-Baptiste Dubois. Henry's homes contained his extensive collection of paintings, including Levitsky's Catherine the Great, as well as statues executed after the antique, decorative paintings after Italian masters, and a magnificent fireplace by Piranesi, now in the Rijksmuseum, that had actually been acquired by his cousin John Hope, but never uncrated by him. Welgelegen, which stands today as the Provincial House of North Holland, was eventually sold to Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland, in 1806. Henry's cousin and business partner John had a house on the Herengracht, estates at Groenendaal and Bosbeek, as well as a house at The Hague. John's collection was recorded in a series of manuscripts which have survived, and which include ivory sculptures, bronzes, woods, micromosaics, silver, mathematical instruments, and cameos. In 1771, along with his uncle Adrian, John bought the well-known collection of Dutch and Flemish pictures belonging to Jan and Peter Bishop. All three of Henry's partners in Hope and Company would die within a 5-year period, that is, his two uncles and his first cousin, Thomas in 1779, Adrian in 1781, and John in 1784. And Henry thereby became the de facto head of the family as well as of the business, though he would eventually take on further partners. This included John Williams, who married Henry's niece and would then add the Hope name to his own. Jeannie shall be discussing the collecting activities of John Hope in greater detail, and particularly how it related to the collections of his 3 sons. I shall therefore just briefly mention that when John died, his collection was divided between his wife, Philippina van der Hoeven, seen up on the screen, and his 3 sons, Thomas, the subject of our 2008 exhibition, his brother Adrian Elias, and his other brother Henry Philip. After Philippina died in 1789, it was Henry who was left sole executor and sole guardian of the 2 younger brothers, Thomas already having reached his majority. The 3 sons would inherit a large collection of paintings and other works of art, as well as properties and, of course, cash, and a share in the company. It is of interest to note that some of the magnificent objects that were inherited from their father would be displayed in Thomas's renowned collection at Duchess Street, and some would even appear in the engravings that he published in Household Furniture and Interior Decoration. John's son, the younger Hope, worked only briefly at Hope & Company, being described as one of our 3 minor partners. The other 2 were his brothers, Adrian Elias and Henry Philip. Tom, it is said, has also taken his place in the counting house and has shown a disposition to devote himself, for the present at least, entirely to it. This was more a case of wishful thinking, as by then Thomas had already embarked on his grand tour from 1787 and returned to Amsterdam only briefly, including in that January, before heading to Rome in 1791. He would not become an active partner in the bank and would continue traveling, recording only 4 further trips to Amsterdam. His capital in Hope & Company and his share of the annual profits were sufficient to fund his wide-ranging travels as well as his interest in the arts. And so it is that we return to October 1794, to those 2 ships, the Unity and Hope, having left Amsterdam, and now waiting near the island of Texel to set sail for London. Henry Hope, as head of the family in both personal and business matters, had assessed the implications of the forthcoming political storm that was about to engulf his hometown, Amsterdam. Henry was waiting to see how the French forces would act and made detailed preparations to remove the family from the war-torn continent to London. Hope & Company were resolutely pro-British and had forged strong Anglo-Dutch alliances. Already in January of that year, Henry had written to Sir Francis Baring in London, "I am so completely in the habit of considering Holland and England in the same country that I can very easily find myself as much at home in the one as in the other." Hope & Company had great associations with the Barings, and with Sir Francis in particular, starting as far back as 1766. The 2 merchant banks developed a strong working relationship and would become inextricably linked. Together, the Barings and Hope, as has already been mentioned twice, would underwrite the Louisiana Purchase from France. In the past, when the Hopes had visited London, they stayed with the Barings. Now, as the Hope Bank in Amsterdam was being wound up, it was with the assistance of Sir Francis, Henry's counterpart in London, that he was able to resettle his family and his business on the other side of the North Sea. Further to this, Henry knew London well. He had worked and studied there. His sister Henry Maria had married John Goddard, an English merchant in Rotterdam, and his niece Anne had married a Cornishman, John Williams Hope. And if you can just see in this detail that Sir Francis is holding a piece of paper inscribed with Hope, if you're able to make it out in the bottom right-hand corner, and the ledger on the table actually belongs to Hope & Company. The Unity and Hope were waiting for a military convoy to accompany them to London, although Henry was pragmatic about how fluid the political and military situation had become. He understood that circumstances may necessitate going without it, but he was also methodical and pragmatic in his decision-making, sending the ships to London, even though they were already packed up with all his family's possessions, was no fait accompli. Analyzing the situation from both sides, Henry saw that if matters contrary to appearance should take a favorable turn here, the vessel, after laying a little time, might return back again. However, he was also prepared for the worst-case scenario, to be able to leave within 24 hours, "We are too complete skeptics in politics," he wrote, "to trust to any appearances, and we shall regulate our conduct on facts, or the clearest indication we can obtain of them from circumstances." He took into consideration the opinion of others that the French will not attempt to penetrate into this province so late in the season, as it may prove as fatal to them as to us, even though he himself did not believe this to be true. "I rather think they will risk the chance of an immediate conquest than incur that of accidents or of giving us so much time to collect and strengthen ourselves." And he eventually writes of the very serious turn matters had taken and decides to fix his family's departure for London. It seems that eventually the Royal Navy itself sent a frigate to escort the ships. The goods on board belonged not just to Henry, but also to his extended family, his sister, her children, as well as his second cousins, the three brothers, Thomas, Adrian Elias, and Henry Philip. It was said that they brought so much of their property that all they left behind were a few chairs and tables. The value of the contents on board was high. Writing to Sir Francis, Henry reiterated that the contents on board the ship were their personal property, that there was not any one article of merchandise, as you will perceive, and we should naturally expect some indulgence in the duties, as the circumstances under which they are imported is a strong argument in favor of it. I reckon the value we put on it barely 2/3 of its real worth. The contents of one ship was insured for just under £57,000. Further to this, the ships also carried priceless items, all the books and papers relating to the Hope's counting house, that is, all the records of the Merchant Bank of Hope and Company, which were being transferred to London to continue with business. Henry arrived in London that October with John Williams Hope, their respective possessions and their family. In January 1795, the Prince of Orange fled to England and the French entered Amsterdam. Another partner in Hope and Company, Peter César Labouchere, had stayed in Amsterdam until the very last moment. London was the financial center of Britain, soon to be of Europe. It was the country's center of politics, being the seat of government, the home to leading artists and craftsmen. This was a city filled with grand townhouses and magnificent private collections of art, with an active and growing art market where the auctions were daily crowded by personages of the first rank, amongst which would soon include the Hopes. Once settled, the family would continue to add to their collections, whether buying at auction or patronizing the city's furniture makers and silversmiths. Every need could be met. Superb markets that sold the freshest foods, extravagant fetes and masquerades, and private gentlemen's clubs that lined St. James's Street from the Palace to Piccadilly. Even though Henry had arrived in London in late 1794, his three cousins, the brothers, would not join him for some time, instead continuing their travels. On the 17th of October, they were recorded by him as setting out for Brunswick. Thomas would be in London the following year, but then leave shortly afterwards to meet up with his brothers and travel through the Ottoman Empire. Upon its arrival in London, Henry's magnificent collection was removed from the ships and transported to his newly purchased house, number 1 Harley Street, which stood at the corner of Cavendish Square. Henry had purchased the house from his distant cousin, James Hope Johnston, the 3rd Earl of Hopetoun, and he lived here with his niece Anne, her husband John Williams, and all of their children, which at that time numbered 5, I believe. Henry's neighbors also had very fine collections of their own, such as that of the 3rd Earl of Bessborough. His new house can be seen on your left in this Thomas Milton Aquatant made the year of Henry's purchase. An inventory of the picture hang has survived and is currently in the archive of the Frick Library. Henry added to the hundreds of paintings that he had brought with him by ship by buying a rich selection of works at auction, including Rubens' Assumption of the Virgin, Annibale Carracci's Christ and the Samaritan Woman, and Nicholas Berghem's The Sibyl's Temple, to name but a few. Continuing the tradition that he had established at Welgelegen, Henry encouraged visitors to make applications to see his house. The German traveler Christian August Gottlieb Guber visited between 1802 and 3, and declared the collection one of the most magnificent in London. Henry also entertained in high style. The Prince of Wales, later George IV, attended his parties. The Hope's good friend, the poet Samuel Rogers, tells of one occasion when the prince ran into his former mistress, the Countess of Jersey, in the gallery at number 1 Harley Street. "We met the Prince of Wales," he wrote, "who, on seeing Lady Jersey, stopped for a moment and then, drawing himself up, marched past her with a look of utmost disdain. Lady Jersey returned the look to the full, and, as soon as the prince was gone, said to me with a smile, 'Didn't I do it well?'" In 1802, Henry commissioned the portrait of his family from Benjamin West, and which he then hung in his dining room in Harley Street. We can see 9 members of the Hope family in the painting. Alongside Henry is his sister Henrietta Maria, Henrietta's daughter Anne, Anne's husband John Williams Hope, and 5 of their children. The painting of Thomas Hope in Ottoman costume that I had up on the screen earlier hung opposite it. Thomas had commissioned the portrait from Sir William Beechey after his 10-year-long grand tour had come to an end, and it was first displayed in Henry's home before eventually being removed to hang above the staircase in his home in Duchess Street. It is of particular interest, to me at least, that an architectural model of Henry's Haarlem house, Pavilion Welgelegen, is included in the portrait, and you can just see it in the upper left-hand corner. This model must have been amongst those possessions brought over from Amsterdam and is surely the model of a country house referred to in the ship's manifest of 1794. The red-figured lekithos or Greek vase standing on the pedestal and the portrait resting against the table were also from Henry's collection. The latter portrait may depict Henry's uncle and former banking partner Adrian Hope, as painted by Cosmo Alexander, who had been patronized by the family when the artist toured Rotterdam in the 1760s. I would just like to end this talk with a final brief mention of Henry's cousins, the 3 brothers Hope, who were very close despite their vastly different temperaments. They traveled together, and their close relationship was reflected in how they chose to buy and commission art. For example, they jointly purchased classical sculpture that was displayed by Thomas at Duchess Street. And Thomas commissioned this Herm-type bust of his brother, Henry Philip, from the sculptor John Flaxman, and installed it center place on his dining room mantel to be flanked by 2 horse heads, Philip in Greek meaning horse lover. Jeannie shall discuss Thomas's house in Duchess Street, which is the best documented of all the Hope's London residences, as was his London house, the Deep Dean in Surrey, both of which are now demolished. Adrian Alliance, who had been described by Henry as being slightly strange, had by 1802, at the Treaty of Amiens, returned to live at his house on the Herengracht in Amsterdam and in those country estates inherited from his father, John. Henry Philip, shown here in a portrait by Thomas Lawrence and completed by Martin Archer Shee, was the most peripatetic of the 3 brothers, constantly traveling or moving homes. Just like his older cousin Henry, he was well spoken of, having an excellent heart and amiable disposition. Henry Philip is depicted, just as his brother Thomas was, as wearing an Ottoman costume, which the Hope brothers believed to be the costume of the contemporary Turkish sailors. It is of some interest that the artist Archer Shee, who completed the portrait from Lawrence, was, from 1799, Henry's neighbor in Cavendish Square. Among Henry Philip's residences was 3 Seymour Place, as seen in this watercolor drawing and a later photograph, with its distinctive balcony supported by 4 caryatids carrying wreaths in either hand. Henry Philip was a prolific draftsman and had drawn the caryatids during his tour of Athens and the Ottoman Empire in the late 1790s. Henry Philip sold this house, as well as its distinctive content that had been modeled after the design of his brother Thomas, to Welbore Ellis Agar, the 2nd Earl of Normanton. Henry Philip is most associated, however, not with his magnificent collection of paintings, nor his collection of furniture, but with a splendid collection of jewels, which included the infamous Blue Diamond, or Hope Diamond, as it is now known, and which is currently in the Smithsonian. It seems that the close family ties disintegrated in subsequent generations when, after Henry Philip's death, Fighting broke out over his collection, and the 3 nephews, who were the sons of Thomas, were locked in ongoing litigation. Returning to Henry Hope briefly, he died in 1811, and his collection was left to his various family members and would eventually be dispersed in a series of sales, the first one held shortly after his death on the 6th of April by Christie's. David Tenier's Country Fete was the single most expensive painting and went to the Prince Regent, later George IV, who may well have seen it hanging in the gallery at number 1 Harley Street. A further 286 pictures were sold on the premises 5 years later, in June 1816, to a most distinguished selection of collectors, which again included prints. This time, the highest price was paid by Sir Philip John Miles for Rubens' The Woman Taken into Adultery, and it was said that the poet Samuel Rogers actually crawled on his hands and knees to buy another painting, Veronese's Mary Magdalene anointing the feet of Christ. Henry's rare Italian marbles, his sculpture, his porcelain, his bronzes, his collection of prints, and finally, in 1817, his magnificent library were sold. It is fitting that the single largest purchaser at Henry Hope's sale was Alexander Baring, 1st Baron Ashburton. Alexander, son of Francis Baring, had started his career at Hope & Company in Amsterdam. At some point, much to his father's chagrin, as I understand it, he refused to take up a partnership in the company, but ultimately landed up divesting the brothers Hope of their interest in the bank when he purchased Hope & Company for over £250,000 in 1813, just 2 years after Henry Hope's death. The collecting and patronage activities of the Hope family would continue for a further generation before being lost to the profligate ways of an eventual heir. It seems apropos to the subject of the seminar, however, that my talk end here with the brief description of the collections of the Hope brothers, as it was during their lifetime that the Hope family connection to the Hope Bank was severed. Thank you.